Open your Bibles up to Acts chapter 20, if you will. That's where we will begin in a couple of minutes. We have recently wrapped up 1 Corinthians. Been in that book for several weeks. And what we're going to do today is, I'm just going to start out by reviewing the main messages of the letters, the epistles that Paul has written up to this point. He's written 4, including 1 Corinthians. And so, starting with 1 Thessalonians, I would have this up on the screen, but I don't know what's going on with that. That's okay. I'm sure they'll get it fixed back there. How do we summarize 1 Thessalonians? Does anybody remember? Be holy and hopeful for the second coming. Stay holy and hopeful for the second coming. So if you just remember second coming, think of 1 Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians and remember kind of the main emphasis is the second coming. All right? Clearly we haven't reviewed this enough with you guys, so it's not your fault. It's our fault as teachers for not reviewing it enough, if you can't remember it. All right, how about 2 Thessalonians? Anybody remember the message for that one? They were thinking the second coming had already come. So Paul is telling them the second coming hasn't happened yet. And then the main message is, so stay holy and hopeful for the second coming. Same as the first book. All right, how about the book of Galatians? Anybody remember the summary for that one? It's about spiritual freedom. It's not in the law of Moses, but spiritual freedom is found in Christ. All right, and then how about 1 Corinthians? Maybe you guys can remember the summary for that one. Love. Love solves all church problems. Okay, so those are the 4 epistles Paul has written up to this point. Now, what we're doing in this study, for those who may not know, is we're studying the book of Acts, and then when we get to the epistles, the letters that Paul writes, we stop our narrative in Acts, and we go and we look at those books, and we come back to Acts. So it's a really engaging way to do it, and it helps us see the whole context. So what we're going to do now is, for the rest of today, we're going to be doing 2 things. One thing is we're going to be studying Acts 19, verses 23 through 42, at some things that happened between the writing of 1 Corinthians and the writing of 2 Corinthians. And then we're going to introduce 2 Corinthians and get into that study starting next Sunday. So, here in Acts 19, first we're going to take a look at this story of the riot that happens in Ephesus. So we begin here doing some reading in verse 23. About that time, and by the way, I forgot to say a couple things I wanted to set up. So Paul, he's been in Ephesus for a while. We read back in verse 10, he'd been there at least 2 years, and we're going to talk a little bit later about the fact that he will stay in Ephesus for a total, does anybody know how long he ends up staying in Ephesus this trip? It's a total of 3 years. So by this point, it's almost the end of that time. So we also learned from verse 22 that he had sent Timothy and Erastus to go into Macedonia. He sent them to go and check on things with the church at Corinth. So if you can try to log that away, we're going to come back to that. So just remember E.T., Erastus and Timothy. Now that's going to stick with you. Everybody got it? So he sends them on. Now verse 23. About that time there occurred no small disturbance concerning the way. For a man named Demetrius, a silversmith who made silver shrines of Artemis, was bringing no little business to the craftsmen. These he gathered together with the workmen of similar trades, and said, Men, you know that our prosperity depends upon this business. You see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a considerable number of people, saying that gods made with hands are no gods at all. Not only is there danger that this trade of ours fall into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis be regarded as worthless, and that she whom all of Asia and the world worship will be even dethroned from her magnificence. So I want to notice, first of all, in verse 23, how does Luke refer to Christianity? What is the term he uses? There was no small disturbance concerning the way. This is the third time in the book of Acts that Christianity is referred to as the way. I just think that's awesome, and I love it, and I want to say it more. So that's just one of my, I would just rather say the way than Christianity. Why is that such an appropriate term? Jesus, John 14, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He is the way to God. Very good. But anyway, there was this man, Demetrius, who was kind of the head honcho of seemingly of this industry. I mean, it wasn't just that he was making a lot of money selling these little shrines, these little amulets of the goddess Artemis, but he was also bringing in a lot of business for a lot of other people. And so they were kind of dependent upon him. And so he's got a big concern here. Now, I'll talk about that concern in a second more, but first show you some statues of Artemis. This is the great mother goddess. She was a local goddess of Ephesus, but she was worshipped all over the Roman Empire. She had been actually for hundreds of years. This is a big deal. She's different from another Artemis, a Greek god that is the huntress, chaste and fair. Now that's a different one. This is the great mother goddess, and what we still have some statues, as you can see, and some of the little statues that we have are small enough to really be worn like as an amulet. We don't have any silver ones left. Why do you think we may not have any silver ones left? It's valuable. People want to melt that down. So we don't have any of those left, but we do know what she looked like and what these little shrines, would have looked like. By the way, your version may not say Artemis. Does anybody have anything different than Artemis? What do you got? Diana. So Diana is Latin for Artemis, which is the Greek word. So really the concern here is about money. That's really what the concern here is really all about. It's all about money. Demetrius is worried about the money. He's got a thriving business, and he's worried that that's about to be affected. This is the agora, the marketplace in Ephesus. So this would have been the very area where Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen would have done their business, would have conducted their business. So he gathers these men together, starts talking to them about how concerned he is about what all is going on. And he's concerned because Paul has persuaded and turned away a considerable number of people. We read there in verse 26, convincing these people that gods made with hands are not real gods at all. We don't have to look very far to see Paul teaching that sort of thing. We know we recently studied 1 Corinthians. There's one thing that they did learn very well in Corinth, at the church at Corinth. They knew that gods made with hands aren't real gods. They didn't have any problem with that. They didn't struggle with that exact point. So the impact that Paul was having is hard for us to appreciate. I mean, we would be thrilled at helping to convert one person. We would be thrilled with that. In Acts 19 and verse 10, starting in the middle of that verse, it says, all who lived in Asia heard the word of the Lord, both Jews and Greeks, from the preaching that Paul did in Ephesus, which is like a big hub. When it says Asia, it means Asia Minor, basically modern-day Turkey. I mean, that's a big area. The word was really spreading. You look at verse 20 of the same chapter. It says, so the word of the Lord was growing mightily and was prevailing. And Paul had a big role in that. And so here you have Demetrius, an unbeliever, and he's saying, look, Paul's having a big, huge effect out here. There's a whole bunch of pagans that are turning away from their idols and turning to this one God. And I'm concerned that if people stop believing in the great Artemis, that we're not going to be able to sell our little amulets anymore. We're not going to have an industry as craftsmen anymore. And we're not going to make any more money. That was the big concern and the big worry. But he did have another concern, at least he said he did. There in verse 27, what was his other concern? Yeah, he was concerned that she might be dethroned from her magnificence. I don't know how much he really cared about that. Maybe he did. but maybe he was just saying that so he didn't just sound like somebody who was only worried about the money. He was also worried about the temple. Why would he be worried about this temple? Not receiving the kind of adulation and respect that it should. It's a really big deal. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the temple of Artemis. I read one ancient writer who said that he had beheld the hanging towers of Babylon, or the hanging gardens of, you don't hang towers, and the pyramids of Egypt, and that they paled in comparison to this temple of Artemis. You see a model of it there. The temple was built in 550 BC, maybe as far back as 570 BC. Now, let's just think about that for a second. That's incredible. Now, it had been partially burned down in year 400 BC, and then another time it was burned almost all the way down in year 356 BC. And one account says that it took 200 years to rebuild it. And it was, imagine that, 200 years to rebuild it. And it was rebuilt to a level of much greater majesty and magnitude than it had been before the fire, or fires. It's a magnificent structure. And it is said that though the building and though the structure itself had been rebuilt and had been changed over time, that the actual statue, the actual idol, had never been changed all those hundreds of years. And they believed that it fell down out of heaven, and they just had so much regard for this God and for this temple. Now, that's what the temple looked like back then. This is what's left of it today. And if you look really close, there's a nest right up there, and a really happy bird on the top of that column. So it still has some use today, the remnants. Oh, and also a good bath for ducks as well. So he's got all this concern. Verse 28 tells us that when the other craftsmen, heard this concern that Demetrius was expressing, they were filled with what? Filled with rage. They're really, really upset that their goddess would be dishonored this way. They're upset that their business might fall into disrepute. And so they begin crying out, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians! Great is Artemis of the Ephesians!" And there's all this ruckus going on. And we saw that picture earlier of the agora, just kind of open. You can imagine that people start hearing this. What's going on? Somebody do something against Artemis? And then the whole town soon starts getting in on this, and people are confused. Who's done what? What has happened? And so there's all this confusion, and the people, verse 29, rush with one accord into the theater. Like, this is a big city. And the idea is it's just like the whole city that is rushed into this. And the rush, that very language indicates intensity, and they're just all out of sorts about this. Here's a picture of this theater. It was the largest in the world at the time, nearly 500 feet in diameter, would seat almost 25,000 people. That's a big deal. And it's still in pretty decent shape. Here's an artistic rendering of what it would have looked something like in Paul's day when all this was going on. So it's not too hard to imagine, just hundreds, if not thousands of people. They're all just rushing around, and they're all upset about Artemis. And what did Paul want to... Oh, by the way, I want to mention, there at the end of verse 29, it says they dragged along 2 people, Gaius and Aristarchus. And so let me just introduce these men to you. You've already been introduced to Gaius before. You may not know it, but in 1 Corinthians 1, Paul said that he himself personally baptized Crispus and Gaius. Besides them, he doesn't know whether he himself baptized anybody else personally. Not that other people weren't baptized. Everybody who's converted into Christ was baptized. But this is most likely that same Gaius, one of the earliest converts in Corinth. We can't know that for sure. It was a common name, but it's probably the same dude. And when Paul writes to the Romans, in the book of Romans in chapter 16, he talks about that he was staying with Gaius. Where did he write the book of Romans from? From Corinth. I think that's almost certainly the same Gaius that was his host. So, then we have this Aristarchus. Aristarchus, we're going to learn later in the next chapter, he was from Thessalonica. We're learning in chapter 27 that Aristarchus went to Rome with Paul. And if he went to Rome with Paul, then what did that mean his situation was? Because he didn't go to Rome on vacation. How did Paul go to Rome? As a prisoner. And so when Paul writes to the Colossians, he names Aristarchus and he calls him his fellow prisoner. And he calls him his fellow worker when he writes to Philemon. So this guy was, both of these two guys, Gaius and Aristarchus, were just Paul's right-hand men, were very faithful to him. And they are dragged into this, literally dragged into the theater along with Paul. And what did Paul want to do there in verse 30? You could hardly hold him back, couldn't you? He wanted to go into the assembly. Paul was a little reckless when it came to his own life. And, we're going to see this later in the book of Acts, but brethren were always like, Paul, no, don't do this. You might die. And he's like, what if I die? What if I die? He was reckless. Which maybe there's something for us to learn there from Paul, who knew what life was all about, and it's not about just preserving oneself. So he's ready. Hey, I'll go. Well, if he had done that, he might have got torn to pieces. So what were the disciples doing? Holding him back. No, Paul, don't do that. They're trying to convince him, But it wasn't only the disciples. Who else was trying to convince Paul not to do that? In verse 31, these officials, and they're called the Asiarchs. And so my center column reference, and if your Bible does not have a center column reference, you really need to make sure to have one that does. Center column reference tells me these are political or religious officials of the province of Asia. These were men of clout. They were men of wealth. They were men who were from different cities, but they were probably here in Ephesus because they were preparing for the games. It was their job to put on the games, to fund the games to a large extent. And so these men aren't described as being believers. What are they described as it relates to Paul? Friends. Now, do you think there's a lesson there? These aren't Christians. They're men of prominence, but they're friends of Paul. Jesus ate with tax collectors and sinners. He befriended people of the world. How are we going to influence people out there if we're like, oh, I can't ever be around those people? Paul was spending time with some pretty powerful men that weren't Christians, but to influence them and to influence them, hopefully, that they might turn to the Lord. And here in this case, they are helping in that they're preserving Paul's life because they're telling him, you'd be crazy to go out there, Paul. Don't do that. They repeatedly urged him. So you just get the feeling that Paul was just like, no, he was just being stubborn. He was going to go do it. And it was all that they could do to keep Paul from going out there and addressing the assembly. So, I'm going to pause here. I'm talking a lot. Anybody have any comments or any questions thus far? Charles?
I guess it's not really a question, but more like a statement. I find it very interesting when there's an individual that is advocating for a specific cause, similar to Paul, and it causes disruption, a monetary disruption to a particular industry or a particular group of people, how do people respond to that? I find that very interesting because, Jesus in a certain realm kind of disrupted a lot of stuff as well, but even bringing things, to its current time, usually when you have an individual who's advocating again for a cause, when money is involved, that's when people really, really get offended or really take it personal because now you're disrupting their system, you're disrupting their flow of life, and usually they all end in the same concept, which is some type of martyrdom, where they got to sacrifice their lives because those who control the industry have just deemed this individual as someone who's totally he's an outcast now, and we got to deal with her basically. Like she's an outcast now, so we got to deal with it. So I was just connecting those dots and thought it was very interesting. Like way back when, the similar things, you can see in modern times. Yeah.
It is, when you look at so many of the problems going on in the world and so much evil that happens, what is at the root of it? So often it's money. Paul says that the love of money is the root of all evil, or the New American Center says a root of all kinds of evil. It's not that that is the only source of all evil, the love of money, but it's such a kind of common denominator of so much of the evil that goes on. And when sticking to the truth means that we are maybe putting other people's careers at risk or our own career, that's when it's really easy to start wanting to compromise the truth. Paul doesn't do that. Brian?
Yeah, I've always found verse 27 really fascinating because their concern is that if people stop worshiping Artemis, she will be dethroned from her magnificence. As if her magnificence is dependent on who worships her and doesn't, or whether people worship her or not. And you contrast that to God. Whether anybody worships him or acknowledges him as magnificent or not does not dethrone him. He can never be dethroned.
Amen.
And so the concern of the gospel when Paul goes to preach to people is not, we need to worship Jesus, otherwise he'll be dethroned from his magnificence. His concern is, Jesus is magnificent, and you better acknowledge that or you'll be lost forever.
And he's going to be magnificent no matter if we worship him or not.
Sure.
That's a great point. Such a drastically different way of just a different way of thinking about a deity than the pagan world was used to. Yeah, absolutely. Very good point. Any other thoughts there before we continue on? Terry?
I think it was in the Waldron book that I read, that they would have little necklaces with little figurines of Artemis, and they would carry those with them when they went on a long journey. And I was thinking about that and how their belief system was that they had to bring a little piece of that God with them for protection because that God was only in Ephesus. That God could not protect them in other parts of the world. I just found that fascinating. And you contrast that with the creator of the universe,
A very, again, pagan way of thinking that I've got to have this physical thing that represents a God who's over there so I can make sure and have that reminder with me and have the protection of that God and so forth with me. Yeah, and we do have to be careful when it comes to objects, that they don't take on a religious significance, even a cross that we wear around our neck or something like that, that it doesn't become this almost religious thing. No, that's nothing. The cross is just a symbol, right? And we need to make sure that the physical symbol doesn't begin to take on the meaning almost of an idol to us. Just be careful of that. I'm not saying it's wrong to wear a cross around your neck or on your ears or something like that. Okay, very good. So, verse 32 says, "So then some were shouting one thing and some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and the majority did not know for what reason they had come together." When I was at South Bumby Church and I'd preached there, Bob Harkrider, we were talking about men's meetings, business meetings. That's when you don't have elders. And the men just meet together in order to make decisions for the church. That's the best they can do. And he said, there's a verse in the Bible for that. And he read this verse. And I've been in those situations, and yeah, that's pretty much about it. But verse 33, the crowd wasn't even sure who all this ruckus was about, right? They thought that it might have been a man named Alexander. So isn't that interesting? At this point, they didn't even know it was over Paul, which maybe that was good for Paul in this situation, for his life. They thought maybe it was this man named Alexander. We don't know anything about Alexander, except we do know he's a Jew. And when the people found out he's a Jew, and of course if you're a Jew, you believe in one God. You don't believe in all these idols. They found out he was a Jew. What did they do? They shouted for 2 hours. Of Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Can you imagine just 2 hours of shouting and nobody even knows what we're doing here? I'm just thinking, don't you people have jobs? Don't you people have anything better to do? You're just going to stand around and shout? And verse 35, finally, somebody steps in. It's the town clerk. And in that day and time, this man actually had a lot of authority. And he quiets down the people and tells them, look, we're going to be in trouble for an unlawful assembly if we're not careful. These men have done nothing unlawful. If you have a concern with them, you can always take them to court. But this is not the place to do any of this, so y'all need to just be quiet and go on home. And so he dismissed the assembly, and you might, get to the end of that and think, well, now, good thing that's over. Everything's going to be better for Paul now. No, this is just kind of the beginning of a lot of very intense persecution that Paul starts to suffer, both here in Ephesus and even when he continues in his travels and goes on up to Macedonia. We'll talk about that. All right, any other thoughts or comments through the end of chapter 19 before we go forward? Will?
How is that an example in contrast to going too far for Paul?
I'm sorry, say it one more time.
How is that an example in contrast to going too far for Paul?
Is that in contrast to,
Like, you obviously you need to, but why did they have to pull him back?
what do they have to do?
Call him reckless when he
Yeah.
was about to go into the temple.
Yeah.
Or the assembly. How
Yeah.
is that reckless?
I don't necessarily mean reckless in a bad way. I just mean Paul his first concern wasn't his own life and his physical safety. He put himself in harm's way all the time, and he did it for good reason, good cause. So I think that in some ways we could be more reckless in that way. Please don't misunderstand what I'm saying, but in terms of looking at the big picture of what this is about, it's not about our happy, healthy, safe life here on earth. It's not about our job and our career. Paul gave all that up to make tents and to barely survive and receive money from churches when he could, be in need and not take money from churches if he had to. He was reckless with his own safety and his own life in that way. So I think there's something for us to learn in that way, not in a bad way, but in a good way.
No, I mean like they had to hold him back from this one certain situation.
Yeah.
Why is that different
Is that different from what?
from any other time where they would not pull him back?
I think they often did, and we're going to see examples of that later. Yeah, of them holding him back from wanting to go and do something that could have got himself killed. Yeah. So I think that was probably something they did often. Does that answer your question? I feel like I'm not answering your question, Will. I'm sorry. I'm trying.
I guess I'm asking how is it like going too far?
How was it? Oh, on their part? Like,
He was trying to go into assembly and
Yeah.
he had to put him to assemblies.
yeah. Because I think that they knew the danger that if he went out there to that assembly that was that angry, they might have just killed him right there on the spot, So that's the idea that I have. That make sense? All right. Good question. All right, let's look at verse 1 now. Verse 1, after the uproar had ceased, Paul sent for the disciples, and when he had exhorted them and taken his leave of them, he left to go to Macedonia. So as we said earlier, he had been in Ephesus by this point for a period of 3 years. We see that in chapter 20 and verse 31. I won't take the time to read that. But it had been 3 successful years. Paul had, as we looked at earlier, had an enormous impact. This had been a very successful work, but now it's kind of cut short. So he leaves Ephesus, he goes up to Troas, then he sails up to Macedonia, and we'll look more at his traveling in just a minute. Let's now talk about 2 Corinthians, because Paul writes 2 Corinthians from Macedonia at this time. This book of 2 Corinthians is a window into the great heart of Paul. It's a deeply emotional book, and we get a rare insight into those tender emotions of the apostle. And, Paul too needed comfort. The Christians at Corinth needed comfort. But Paul needed comfort. He needed the comfort of God. He needed the comfort of his brethren. He even asked them, open your heart up to me. I'm open to you. Why aren't you open to me? He needed that. He needed that. And we don't think of that sometimes. He was an apostle. He was like you and I. He was still sensitive. He still needed support and comfort. And he wanted that so desperately from his brethren. But one reason he could continue on, with his ministry is because the ministry of the gospel was so great it's worth any cost. And that's one of the great messages and repeating themes of the book. And that's what can keep us going too when we're discouraged and when nobody might be listening and when we just feel like it's not worth it and when we might even be suffering as a result is, look, the ministry of the gospel is worth whatever cost that it takes for us to be part of that and to ultimately make it to heaven. That's worth anything and more than we could ever give. So Paul is deeply burdened. What is burdening Paul? Can you think of some of the things that, and we've kind of already touched on some of the things, but what are some things that are burdening Paul at this time? Jack?
One thing is his concern for all the churches.
Yes.
He mentions that.
Yes, in 2 Corinthians 11. At the end of that long list of all the things that Paul endured and suffered, he said, on top of all that, I have a deep concern, and literally the word there is anxiety for all the churches. And he was concerned about the church at Corinth, too. So, yeah. What else was he concerned about, Brian?
Suffering in Asia that he's got in Ephesus.
Yes. Yeah, and I'll mention that. So, first of all, the trouble in Ephesus, in chapter 1. Why don't we just kind of look a little bit, go to 2 Corinthians. Chapter 1, and look at verse 8. He says, "For we do not want you to be unaware, brethren, of our affliction which came to us in Asia, that we were burdened excessively beyond our strength, so that we despaired even of life." So apparently, even after that great uproar and that riot, he continued to be persecuted and to suffer and thought that he might even die. He was burdened about what was going on in Corinth. He had written a sorrowful letter to them. He talks about that in 2 Corinthians. I think it's 1 Corinthians is what he's referring to. He wrote that in many tears. He was caused sorrow because he knew it caused them sorrow. And that was tearing him up. That was hard for him. And also the persecutions that were happening in Macedonia. Look in chapter 7 and verse 5. Chapter 7 and verse 5, he said, "For even when we came into Macedonia, our flesh had no rest, but we were afflicted on every side, conflicts without, fears within." This is the Apostle Paul. Paul, you weren't scared of anything. What does he say? Conflicts without, fears within. Even the Apostle Paul, who had the Holy Spirit. I mean, it's okay to be afraid. Right? Like, that's just part of it. What's not okay is if the fear stops us and holds us back from doing what needs to be done. Right? So that's where courage is. Courage is not the absence of fear. What is courage?
It's doing it in the face of it.
It's action in spite of the fear. We're going to be afraid. And if we are faithful to Jesus, we will face conflicts. The only way we don't do that is if we just sit back and say nothing and do nothing that will shine the light of Christ. But if we're doing that, we're not being Christians anyway. We're just wearing the name of Christ. Because to be a Christian means to be a Christ follower. And Christ said, "Shine your light so all may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." So when you do that, it's going to cause conflicts. When you do that, it's going to be scary. And if you let that fear hold you back, then you're not fulfilling God's will for your life, and neither am I if we do that. I don't want to trample on the territory that Brian's going to speak to, because he's going to talk about comfort. And so I don't want to go too far on this, but when I consider all these burdens that Paul is having at this time, I just try to relate a little bit to that. We all had a pretty rough year. And we might be feeling burdened as well. Like, man, is this stuff not going to let up? That's a very small taste of what Paul was experiencing. Again, I don't want to go into Brian's territory, but I think we can learn a lot from Paul and what he was going through here. All right? Now, Paul's travel plans have changed. Now, we're going to talk next week, next Sunday, Lord willing, about some big travel plans that changed in a big way. They changed a couple times. But right now what I'm talking about is just his current travel plans. He was planning to remain in Ephesus for a certain amount of time, and that all changed. There had been this great door of opportunity that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 6, verse 9. Why don't we kind of flip back there? 1 Corinthians 16, not 6. 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 9. He says, "For a wide door for effective service is open to me, and there are many adversaries." That was when he wrote 1 Corinthians, when things were still going pretty good. He was being persecuted all the time, but there was a great door of opportunity for the preaching of the gospel. And he was like, I'm going to take advantage of this opportunity. And so he was saying, I'm going to stay here in Ephesus for a little while. I'm not quite ready to come and see you at Corinth yet. I want to take advantage of this marvelous opportunity, which is a lesson itself, right? It's called a door of opportunity for a reason. That door is going to close eventually. If we don't take that opportunity while that door is open, eventually that door will close, and that opportunity will be gone forever. We'll never get that exact opportunity at that time ever again. So Paul's like, while this door is open, I want to take the opportunity. So he wanted to stay a while. It seems that he ended up needing to leave earlier than expected. If you kind of back up, you look like, starting back in verse 5 of that same chapter, 1 Corinthians 16, he says, "But I will come to you after I go through Macedonia, for I am going through Macedonia, and perhaps I will stay with you, or even spend the winter, so that you may send me on my way wherever I may go. For I do not wish to see you now just in passing, for I hope to remain with you for some time, if the Lord permits." Now look at verse 8. "But I will remain in Ephesus until Pentecost." When is Pentecost? What time of the year? About. It's in the spring, all right? It's in the late spring. So that was his plan. So apparently he wasn't able to stay till late spring. He left earlier than that. And it's going to throw all sorts of things out of whack, as we'll talk about in just a second. So let's have a look a little bit more at his traveling. So he leaves Ephesus. He goes up to Troas. In chapter 2, look in chapter 2 and verses 12 and 13. Chapter 2, verses 12 and 13, he says, "Now when I came to Troas for the gospel of Christ, and when a door was opened for me in the Lord, I had no rest for my spirit, not finding Titus my brother, but taking my leave of them, I went on to Macedonia." So he was hoping to meet Titus. Titus is likely the one who delivered the letter of 1 Corinthians, and he had spent some time with the church at Corinth, and Paul had evidently instructed him to come back and meet with me. So, he was waiting for him to come. I'm not sure why he or Paul didn't just go buy a cell phone. It could have been a whole lot easier. They could have just communicated a lot quicker, but they wandered around. Well, we are spoiled in our modern day, right? So they didn't have that. So he had no idea, when's he coming? Where am I going to find him? He was hoping to meet him in Troas. Interesting, there was a great door of opportunity in Troas. But because Paul was so distraught, even Paul could not take that door of opportunity for the gospel's sake. I'm sure he kind of regretted that. But, he was emotional, just like all of us. And that sometimes gets the better of us. And so he leaves Troas and he sails across the Aegean up into Macedonia. Now, we don't know what all cities he went where each one of these things happened. There were 3 main cities in Macedonia. That was Berea, Thessalonica, and Philippi. But we know that while he was in Macedonia, he was afflicted terribly, conflicts on every side. And then Titus, he finds Titus. Paul finds Titus. He meets him there in Macedonia somewhere. I imagine the providence of the Lord just kind of brought them together. How they found each other, I'm not sure. And Titus brought a good report. Look in chapter 7, 2 Corinthians 7, and verses 6 through 8. But God, starting verse 6, "But God who comforts the depressed Look at that. Comforts, Paul calls himself the depressed. You ever feel depressed? You can kind of relate with Paul a little bit. But God who comforts the depressed comforted us by the coming of Titus. And not only by his coming, but also by the comfort with which he was comforted in you, as he reported to us your longing, your mourning, your zeal for me, so that I rejoiced even more. So they had repented. There was a lot in 1 Corinthians that they needed to repent from. And they had repented, and they were longing for Paul. But Titus, although this context doesn't tell us here, also told him of some bad news, because Paul writes about that in 2 Corinthians. There were false apostles among the Corinthians who were trying to discredit Paul, discredit his work, discredit his conduct, discredit his ministry, discredit his apostleship. And they were having an influence. And I think that was the primary concern Paul had that he was addressing in 2 Corinthians, was those men and their terrible influence. So there was that. And then he also caught up with Timothy. Now remember, I told you earlier when we started class to try to remember, Paul had sent 2 men to go to Corinth. Remember E.T.? We know Timothy. Who was the other one? Erastus. And so he had sent them, and they were still on their way. So Paul is catching up with Timothy, and he meets Titus on his way back. That's how that happened. And so he catches up with Timothy. Timothy joins Paul in the salutation at the beginning of the book, so we know that he had found Timothy by the time he writes this letter. And that was a great comfort to Paul. And it was from Macedonia that Paul wrote 2 Corinthians. The year was AD 57. Any questions or comments before we look at the outline for the book? Okay. So 3 parts to the book. 3 sections. The first section is chapters 1 through 7, where Paul defends his conduct and he defends his ministry. And then we have the middle section is verses 8 and 9, where Paul gives instructions concerning the collection for the Jerusalem saints. They needed to finish this work that they had started. They needed to be liberal givers and cheerful givers in contributing to this need that the Jerusalem saints had. And then the third section is chapters 10 through 13, and that was where Paul defended his apostleship in particular. And it's a more powerful defense of his apostleship than even the book of Galatians. Very, very powerful. So there we have the 3 sections. Summarizing 2 Corinthians was not easy because it's about so many different things. So I don't have a summary. No, I'm just kidding. I have one. It is this. I think this is the common thread that weaves itself through the whole book, is Paul is defending himself. He's defending his conduct, defending his character, defending his ministry, defending his apostleship. But he's not doing it for himself. He's doing it for their sake. Now, how could Paul, defending himself, how could he be doing that for their sake? How could his defense of himself be beneficial for them?
Just so that way they can really receive it.
They're not going to receive his message if they have no regard for him. Yeah. Jack?
Very soon, be able to tell the real from the fake.
Very soon going to be able to tell the real from the fake. Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons Paul wasn't accepting money, because these false teachers, that was their motive. These false apostles. One verse I want to read before we get to the bell. Chapter 12, verse 19. To me, this verse kind of summarizes the major purpose of the book. Paul says, all this time, you have been thinking that we are actually defending ourselves to you. Actually, it is in the sight of God that we have been speaking in Christ, and all for your upbuilding, beloved. Paul's saying, I'm not defending myself for myself. I'm doing this for you, for your upbuilding and for your spiritual benefit. So Paul defends himself for the Corinthians' sake. It's not very catchy. Brian and I tried. Maybe you could come up with something better than that, but I'd rather be clear than catchy. So that's clear. It's not catchy, but it's clear. So try to remember that. I'm going to drill you next week. So try to remember. All right, so Wednesday we are not having class. We're going to have a prayer service. And I'll be organizing this, and then Sunday we'll be continuing in our study, and then the following Wednesday we'll be having a singing. So, but a prayer service for this coming Wednesday. Thanks everybody for your attention.